The Caterham 7 is simplicity of driving in its purest form. And now that very same DNA of simplicity is spawning a sister vehicle, one that's looking to literally charge boldly into the future in a whole new direction as a second prong for Caterham cars. And that is this, the Caterham V. And as you'll see, this is a car that, although a concept, doesn't seem very far from production at all. And it's actually a really unique looking sports car in the market. So guys, the Caterham 7 is probably the longest running production car ever, I think. When you look at the fact that its ancestor began in 1957, this was of course a car that was envisioned by the creator of Lotus, who was the marvelous moustache man known as Colin Chapman. And he had this thought that when you add power to a car, yes, you'll be faster on the straights, but if you reduce weight, you will be faster everywhere. And it was this idea that created his mantra of simplify, then add lightness. And this is something that's continued to this day in the Caterham car. So now 60 years later, and in fact 50 years since Graham Nairn bought the rights of building the 7 off Lotus, who were going in a completely different direction, nothing has really changed. You can still buy the 7. There's 2 chassis options. One is the original size one is the wider and longer one. Their order books are still full of like 600 cars a year. And a waiting list, and because of that waiting list, they're moving into a new factory. And while there are versions of this car that are really powerful, the idea is still not power today. The idea is still simplify and add lightness. For example, our entry-level 170 weighs 440 kilograms, which is insane. You add a passenger in there, your power-to-weight ratio goes out the window. And even the larger, more powerful car is at 610 kg. So when you then look at that company in the frame of moving into the future, you can kind of start to understand where some concerns may lie. But be that as it may, the future is coming faster than you could drive a Caterham 620, right? So Caterham, as I see it, have 2 choices. Either we can love the current cars literally to death, and that would be the end of the company, or take a 2-prong approach, continue producing the 7 and have something that boldly charges into the future. And Caterham CEO Bob Lashley has rightly, I think, chosen the latter, and hence is born our Caterham Project V. But how true will this new car remain to that ethos of, simplify and adding lightness? Because we all know EVs are by nature super heavy because of the batteries and everything that has to go into the modern car. But I can tell you now that they are aiming for a weight of just under 1,200 kg, which is really, really light. And I'll talk more about that at the end, because this is a really significant topic. But now let's move on to the EV side, because it's really important of what have they done under the skin here in order to keep the weight down and, be true to their mantra of simplicity. And it starts with our chassis. So we have a very clever composite structure here of carbon fiber and aluminium. You can see it's all very minimalist. We've got a double wishbone front suspension and a double wishbone rear. We've got electrically assisted steering. So there's no faff in here. There's not, a plethora of different systems going on. We haven't got like 360-degree cameras. We haven't got massaging seats. We haven't got a whole host of things. Not even an infotainment system. I'm going to explain all of that when we go in the car. But this is really, you can see how hard Caterham are drilling down and staying true to who they are. Now let's talk about the electric side. Of course, we have an electric motor. This sits on the rear, so it only drives the rear wheels. It's a 200 kilowatt electric motor. And alongside that, we've got 55 kilowatt battery split into 2 bits, one thinner at the front of the car, so you still sit nice and low for a sports car, again, as we'll see later, and then a thicker, similar capacity on the rear. The total is 55 kilowatt altogether. And that is it. So all in all, we end up with a target weight of 1190 kg, which, as I said, is bloody light. Think about it with this lens on, right? The upcoming Porsche EV sports car is alleged to have around about 1,700 kilos worth of weight. So you can see just how much difference a completely stripped out EV sports car is making just in terms of weight. And that is the simplicity that Caterham keep talking about. And in terms of performance figures, we've got 268 brake horsepower, a 0 to 60 quote of around about 4.5 seconds and a top speed of 143 miles per hour. The WLTP range on the battery is actually quite impressive. It's around about 250 miles or 400 kilometers, which is really good as well. And from what I've calculated, power to weight ratio is somewhat similar to something like a 992 Carrera. So it's not like mad fast, but that's never what Caterham has been about. What it is for a production sports car is actually mad light. Now, there's one other part of the story that we haven't touched on yet, and that is, of course, the interior, and it is a significant part of that story. But before we go into that, I want to have a really close look around the design of this car so you guys get a really good idea of what it looks like in the person, because I love the muscularity of it, and then we will head inside the car. So guys, let's have a closer look at the design. When I see this in person, it reminds me of a lot of British sports cars, because I think a lot of them were birthed from that very basic kind of race car design back from the 1950s. So it's no surprise that the Caterham kind of takes on that kind of, you know, whether you liken it a bit to Jag or a few other, you know, icons from the British car industry. There's a bit of that, but undoubtedly there's so much of that Caterham 7, particularly in the front end. I think that's where you get the biggest hit of that DNA. So let's come in closer and have a look at some of that. If we get low down, the grille is kind of the biggest one out of the lot, right? It's a very, very recognizable Caterham grille. So that first bit is great. You've got a Caterham badge on here, which is actually quite nice. But then here, it's great because there's a lot of simplicity around this area. If you have a look at this, yes, we've got our aero feature over here, which obviously we need to bring air into the tires, and you've got your massive diffuser at the bottom. But this is only there because it needs to be there. It's a tool for a purpose. And similarly with the lights and the covering around the wheel, you need that because this is a more standard mass-produced production car. Otherwise, this would look very much like a 7. I like the lights. The lights are nice. They're still round, like our 7 is. You've got the lovely Caterham logo in there as well. They're blacked out, which look good. And bear in mind, obviously, this is the standard car. So imagine when you're speccing it. This, for example, we were discussing with Anthony, the designer. This could be exposed carbon fiber, for example, maybe. You could have the diffuser maybe in a different color. There's a lot going on here that could really change the way that this car looks. But I think it's this front end, this kind of the reduction of the bits in here to amplify that simplicity that I really like. And just that whole front, it just screams like they've got the DNA element, I think, nailed there. And then, of course, you've got necessary things like your DLRs here, which, again, that's a nice simplistic way of doing it, I think. Well, I think that's probably my favorite bit. And it's nice then how that cuts into where our wheel is here, and you can clearly see the tire through that. And there's an even more exaggerated version of that on the rear that I'll show you in a minute. And then the side of the car, you're going to see this very, very clear. Once I show it to you, you'll get it. There's a symmetrical kind of muscle on our front flank and our rear flank that looks basically identical on both sides. But there's like numerous layers to this. You've got the sports car greenhouse. You've got the really, really sharp edges of our door here, which I think are great, but it's still very simple. And then the typical sports car large side sill here for aerodynamics, which looks great. You've obviously got your charging port here, and then wheels, a staggered setup of 19 and 20. Quite Caterham looking, I think. But my favorite bit, honestly speaking, is the rear. Now, the rear is really nice, isn't it? There's so much muscle to it. There's almost like a bit of American muscle to the whole thing. I don't know if you guys can see it with like the muscle of our rear end here, the way this kind of swoops up. The straightness of the back is very retro. The lights, in fact, so the tail lights, they're kind of like a little nod to the old Lotus Elan style, particularly with this flat element and how this curves up here. But if you come closer, just have a look at how many different levels and sections we have here. We've got a defined sharp cut here, this flatness, you've got the spoiler and the way that lifts. You've got the beautiful brake light that sits in our rear windscreen here. You come further down and it cuts again and then goes into our diffuser. And then the best bit, let me show you. Check that out. You can literally, you know, that's like something you see in a Valkyrie or a Project One or something. And it's the great thing about EVs that you have less hardware and stuff that you need to worry about. So the aerodynamic element here allows us to let the air out from our rear tires from here. And it looks great. You've got another brake light at the bottom here. But let me just show you, look at that muscle on the rear. And bear in mind the size of car that I told you this is. That just looks so, so impressive, doesn't it? I wish I could have seen this in the wild, because I reckon in a real world setting, this would look even better. But with those really defined cuts, you know, the muscle of our arches, yeah, that is a good looking sports car. Now let's head inside And the other half of the story is, of course, the interior. So guys, here we are with the interior of the Caterham V, and it's really nice. It's genuinely nice. What's really nice about it is that you sit very flat in it, but then that's not, you know, it's quite reminiscent of how you sit in a 7 anyway. But of course that's because you've got the batteries underneath us, but they've done a good job, as you saw, of keeping those batteries slim. This feels like you're in a proper, it actually feels to me more like I'm sitting in a supercar. Now to begin with, because this is a Caterham, what I want to do is show you what the normal 7's interior looks like compared to this, because it's very, very similar. Right? First of all, the thing that you notice is that you still have the dials here. And whereas on the 7, it's showing how much fuel you have, etc., and your clock. On here, we have your electric charging, we have the clock, and we have your modes between normal, sport, and sprint, which obviously adjust steering, power, and suspension, etc. So that's nice. But alongside that, the actual shape is still very, very Caterham. You've got that completely flat front dashboard. You've got the dials. You've got a really tiny, absolutely tiny steering wheel that, you know, as soon as you see it, although it is Caterham specific now, you know, it reminds you of the 7. Kind of, it's a homage, but it's very much in the future. And like I said, it feels more like a supercar interior in here, particularly the way that our front dash curves back here. And I'll show you a first person view of that as well. So this is your first person view, as you can see. We've got the dials loading up, and these dials, as far as I can see, are the exact same design as you get within your 7 as well, or at least a very close digital version of what you get in the 7, which is nice. You've got a nice start-stop button over there as well, and this is your gear selector on this side, and of course you've got these vents, which are quite nicely done. Pulley door handles, which is nice to have in an EV as well, and the door card's quite nicely designed. And this steering wheel is tiny. I can't explain to you. I haven't got massive hands, all right? But this is a small steering wheel. But I like the simplicity of it, and it's nice that Caterham have their own kind of steering wheel design going on now. I like the fact that we have our dials in the middle here, again linking to the 7, even though on this it's electric, your clock, and then the driving modes. And speaking of driving modes, you can see them here. You've got sport, normal, sprint, etc. You've got your hazard lights, and then your air conditioning, and even regen in here. We haven't got a typical entertainment system on here. So when you get in the car, essentially what will happen, you will pop your phone inside here, and then you will get either Apple CarPlay or Android Auto on here, which to be fair is what most of us do anyway, right? Apart from that, you've got these lovely switches as well, these mechanical switches. Then you've got some nice dials in the middle here, but it's very, very simple, very kind of, you know, everything is stripped back, and that's why we've maintained the weight as being quite low. The seats are actually lovely. They're really nicely done. The side bolsters hug you quite well, and they seem fairly comfortable. And then you can kind of see the way that kind of dashboard curves, and why I was saying this feels a bit more supercar than sports car, but like maybe older supercar. But I like that. I like that element. But it feels like you've got a lot of bang for buck in here for what's going to be potentially a sub 80k car. And of course, the other big thing is the rear. Let me show you the second row. All right, guys, here we go. We're jumping in the rear. In the rear. It's not bad. You just about fit me in. It's not like, this is kind of like 911 or SL, right? This is for kids. But you can also have a 2-seat option in the rear, allegedly, as well. That's something that they're working on, or the 2+1. So either 2+2 or 2+1. But it's nice. You've got, you know, a bit of daily usability in this. Pop the kids in the back. Yeah, they're cramped, but who cares? Because we're driving the sports car in the front. So guys, that's your Caterham Project V. I really find this really interesting, particularly when I look at this through the lens of Lotus, who were a company with similar origins, right? And they've gone the safe route. They've gone down the SUV, the sedan route. But then you've got Caterham with those same origins who've instead stuck true in a decision that it's not guaranteed success, right? To like strip something down completely and to still have it as a mass seller, but they have done that. They're kind of, you know, they've doubled down on who they are in an EV. And there's just something that I really admire about that. So I'm really excited to see what happens on a production car of this. Of course, guys, if you've enjoyed this episode of RVR, as always, please do like and subscribe. It is hugely appreciated. And I will see you guys on the next one.